General Dempsey, it is good to see you. As you know, but as our audience may need to be reminded, you were the 18th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So you were chosen for that function, which is the highest military office or the highest military position by President Obama. You served 4 years in that, and then you left that to come back to your alma mater, to Duke, where you had received your MA. And you've been at Duke since as a Rubenstein Fellow. And you also are chairman of USA Basketball. So we were having a lively discussion about the Olympics upcoming. It would almost be fun to have you come back and talk about basketball. But today we're talking more about your military hat. Welcome to Duke.
Thanks. Good to be back. A couple of things. First of all, it's great to be back with you, Peter. And first time I've seen you in a long time. And then before that, first time I've seen you without a mask in a long time. And I've forgotten just how dashing you actually are.
Well, thank you. I've had some work done.
Haven't we all?
Yes.
Second, today's the Army birthday, 246 years young today, and it's Flag Day. And so I think this conversation comes at a good time.
Well, I want to begin by asking you about the title we gave your talk, which might have caught folks by surprise if they didn't know where it came from. Tell us where the title comes from and what it means to you.
The title comes from the oath that we all take, officer and enlisted, upon entering service, but also every time along the way that we're promoted. And the oath is unique. Our oath, that is to say, the oath of the American military person is unique in the world in that we swear our allegiance to a set of ideas, not to a party, not to a potentate, not to a ruler, not to any individual or group. And we remind ourselves of that, that what we are swearing our allegiance to is to that set of ideas and ideals that are captured in the Constitution of the United States.
So in addition, it says you will protect these ideals, you'll protect the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So the foreign enemies, that's easy to imagine. But the domestic, that probably is jarring to some people's ears. What are the domestic enemies that the oath has in mind there?
Yeah, it's interesting you ask, because what I thought you would ask is, how did I think about that when I took the oath? And I probably took, I was promoted 10 times in my career. And so I took the oath at least 10 times, and I administered it thousands of times. And I will tell you that that part of it really was rote memorization without much thought, because it never occurred to me that I had to worry about the domestic part of, protect against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So I guess what you're asking me is, what do I think of it now? Because I didn't have to actually, though it was always, it was always present. And, the question about what that oath means to our profession. And I probably should also mention, the reason we take that oath is that we consider ourselves a profession, something beyond a simple job, something beyond an occupation, where we live to a certain standard against a certain ethos and hold ourselves accountable. We like to believe we're self-policing, if you will, in our interest of maintaining our standing as a profession. And that standing, by the way, is only important in that it allows the American people to have confidence in us, that we represent them and all of them, the people with whom we agree and the people with whom we disagree. So when you ask, how do I think about the domestic part of that oath? It begins to remind me, first and foremost, maybe ironically, that how important it is for us to be seen as nonpartisan. Now, notice I didn't say apolitical, because one of the things I've thought about since the events of the last 20 years, probably not 4, is that when we say we are apolitical, we're kidding ourselves. We all have our beliefs in how the country should be run and by whom, because they more closely comport with how we think the country should be run. But we do have to be nonpartisan in the sense that as elections change, the people who are representing the American population in Washington, who then become those who give us our marching orders. That can't matter to us unless something is done that's illegal. And to your point now, this was a long windup for the pitch. In my mind, it comes down to a domestic enemy of the United States would be someone who was purporting or advocating or actually acting out in a way that was illegal.
Okay. So there's a number of threads I could pull there. Let me pull the last one,
Okay.
Which was quite the point about illegal, because that sounds more like law enforcement. Isn't that why we have the FBI? Isn't that why we have local law enforcement? So are you suggesting that the military has a role in as the ultimate backstop to law enforcement?
Yeah, that's the right question. And the military is not the arbiter of the law. We don't interpret the law. The law is clearly interpreted by those charged with, first of all, making the laws, and then secondly, interpreting them. What we are responsible for, and this, by the way, this is new to me. I mean, as I mentioned to you, this is not something I spent a lot of time thinking about for the first 40 years of my military career. But the military, in my judgment, has a role in preserving the institutions who are the arbiters of the legality of particular actions that will or will not be taken by the state, it seems to me.
And of course, historically, the gravest threat we ever had to the Constitution was in the Civil War, right? That's when the country was rent apart and almost broken.
Right.
And the Army had a role in fighting for the Union and restoring the constitutional order. So perhaps part of the oath is imagining or has a threat like that in mind. We haven't faced a threat like that at that scale since. But in the 150 or so years since then, there have been threats or believed to be threats of internal subversion. During the Great Wars, World War I, World War II, there were fears that there were enemies, agents of influence, and the military had a role in addressing that, didn't they?
They had a role in addressing it, but they're again back to the most important point, which is a role in addressing it when asked to do so by those duly constituted and in support of law enforcement, not as a second and separate entity.
Right. Well, the other reason you and I deliberately picked this title for our conversation is because if you think about the last year, just a year ago, what were we talking about a year ago? We would have been talking about the Lafayette Square incident, and I believe it was a year ago today that, or last week, I should say, that General Milley made a public apology, which was that General Milley is your successor. So for the last year, the domestic role of the military and the role that the military is playing in our political conversation, whether they want to or not, has been quite prominent, which is why I wanted to press you on this. In a moment, we'll get to the foreign stuff. But let me just push you a little bit further on the domestic stuff. Let's take last June 2020, the incident in Lafayette Square. It was an extraordinary moment in American civil military relations. The president was asking his advisors, suggesting to his advisors, he wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act, which is a legal framework that allows him to mobilize active duty forces to backstop law enforcement, as you just described, to deal with folks who were protesting the murder of George Floyd and related issues. His military and civilian advisors all recommended against it. So Milley recommended against it. The Secretary of Defense, Esper, recommended against it. The Attorney General recommended against it. So there was pushback from his own team, but the president was really leaning forward in that. Can you put yourself in that role? If you had been Milley, would you have advised against invoking the Insurrection Act, do you think? And if so, why?
Well, based on what I knew, and I didn't, because I'm retired now, I didn't know any more than anyone else watching the news. And I mean, I was avidly trying to understand, because these things are very important to me, even in retirement. But based on what I saw and based on what I believe I knew, the protest had not reached a point where they were at any risk of overwhelming the civilian law enforcement institutions. And the National Guard was already in place as a backstop. So what the Insurrection Act would do is add to that the active duty force. And the active duty force didn't seem to be necessary in that regard. And using it in that way when it's unnecessary creates doubt in the minds of the American people about whether the military is an arm of a particular politician or an arm of a particular party, or whether it is actually working for what they believe to be the best interest of the people of the United States. And that's why I would have said, Mr. President, I strongly recommend against it, knowing that he could say, I got your advice, but I'm the commander in chief and I'm going to invoke it.
And if he had it, that would have been a legal order.
Yes.
It? Yeah. And so General Milley would have been duty bound to do what?
He would have been duty bound to activate the forces that the president asked for. But that would lead to another conversation, I'm sure, between all of the people you mentioned and the president about, okay, we've activated them, we've positioned them, but for God's sakes, don't use them unless, we as a group see that the local law enforcement and the National Guard are about to be overwhelmed.
And just as a sidebar, how unusual is it for the president or one of his senior advisors to have an idea and the military say, yes, maybe better think that idea a second time, or the president of the military, the president doesn't want to do something and the military says, sir, you might have to do something.
Is that unusual at all?
Okay, so that's not a sign of a system broken.
No, it's not the sign of a system broken. It's, I suppose what made it noteworthy is that it was, well, first of all, everything in that moment was playing out with complete scrutiny. Everybody knew everything about what was going on in the moment,
right?
Which makes it really hard to make good decisions.
Through leaks, basically.
Leaks, through Twitter, through, whatever it was. And so, it felt like everyone was involved in the decision and everyone had their own opinion about it, which actually makes the system a little hard to manage sometimes.
Well, but it bears emphasis, and I tell my students this all the time, the president doesn't always get what his whim is, and the civil military relations isn't a system designed to give the president whatever is his fancy in a moment.
Right.
It's designed to give the president options, considered options, that might require that he has to do something that he didn't really want to do, but he decides that's the least worst option. And in this case, President Trump decided not to invoke the insurrection.
That's right.
And so he didn't, but he did something else, which caused General Milley then to issue an apology. And how would you describe what came next? Because that in some ways is the more interesting from the civil military.
Well, first of all, for everyone listening, what he did was he invited the chairman to accompany him over to the church for a photo op. Now, again, the history of this will be what it is. It's a little bit unclear whether everyone knew it was a photo op or whether they were actually going to look at some of the damage that had occurred at the church. But in any case, the protesters were cleared. The president invites the chairman to accompany him. The chairman says, yes, sir. And off he goes. He's in a battle dress uniform, that was odd, by the way, because I don't think I ever, in fact, I'm confident I never went to the White House in anything except my dress uniform because of the gravity of the place. But anyway, he happened to be in his battle dress uniform. He went over, the photo op occurred, and actually he didn't stand for the photo op, but his image was caught as he walked across. Now, first of all, let me tell you that I was involved in hundreds of photo ops. Every time the president signs the federal budget or the defense budget, he generally gathers his military around to demonstrate to the American people two things. One, that he or she supports the military. And secondly, that the military are comfortable enough with the budget that they're all standing there, sometimes smiling and sometimes stoic, but they're all standing there. So photo ops are just part of politics in Washington. What made this one different was that it had the appearance that the chairman had been involved in as the senior active duty military man in the country, had a role in clearing Lafayette Square, which he, as far as I can tell, did not. But it had a very complicated and confusing. When I saw that, it took my breath away, actually. And I talked to him about it.
And that was not the message he wanted to send.
No, clearly not.
And when people got that message unintendedly, he followed up by apologizing.
He did. He had a speech within a week at the National War College graduation.
Yeah.
And he publicly apologized.
Which is a remarkable. I'm trying to remember, did you ever issue a public apology like that?
I don't think I ever, in a speech for something I had done, issued an apology. I did express in sessions with you and with the media and in congressional testimony, express regret about, not being able to do enough in Syria, or not anticipating that ISIS would, run across northern Iraq in 2014. So there were always moments of, we could have done this better, but I never felt it rose to the level of, I apologize for the decision I made.
One of the reasons he apologized, I believe, was that he was under some pressure from very senior, respected, retired military who he respected. I know Admiral Mullen had publicly written on this. Had you tweeted about
Not
this?
about that, but as I mentioned to you,
Yeah.
we were on the phone
Okay.
Right after.
And he was probably talking to many others who had, well, you can tell me well, maybe you won't want to tell me what you told him privately, but I infer what he heard was, you might need a mulligan. That wasn't good.
That's about as good a description as I can give it without using 4-letter words.
Okay. And so some were putting pressure on him to resign over this. Do you think that a resignation like that is a good step to make for a senior officer? Talk a little bit about the difficulty of a senior officer at that level, at your level, resigning in a moment like that.
Well, first of all, the resignation of the chairman or of any senior military leader can be immediately misinterpreted and has a shelf life of about 30 minutes and can really complicate the image that the chairman needs to have, again, as an advisor, number one, the steward of the profession, and that individual who has the ability to harmonize the services and combatant commanders and our allies toward the common purpose of national security. So when a chairman, if a chairman were to resign, it seems to me it would have to be in response to something illegal that you're being asked to do. Mr. President, I cannot do that, therefore I offer you my resignation. Short of that, I think it's a mistake to resign. I mean, it's a hard job. And nobody said it has to be comfortable and easy on you. And I think Mark Milley really learned that the hard way. But I think it would have been a mistake for him to resign in that moment.
I agree. And for what it's worth, I thought that the apology was deftly delivered.
Yeah.
And done once. He didn't need to then go on an apology tour.
That's right.
And so it was there. It was in a teaching moment, literally a teaching moment in a university graduation exercise.
Filled with future generals and admirals.
Right. And so it was done and he moved on.
Yep.
But of course, the country did not completely move on, because from that point on, he was asked a question that I bet you were never asked, which was, what is the role of the military in the presidential election?
I was never asked that.
Did you ever get that? But he was asked that question repeatedly. And he gave always the same answer, which was the answer you gave at the beginning, which is, we swear an oath to the Constitution, not to an individual. And this is, the Constitution lays out how this is going to happen. And there's not a role for the military there, full stop.
Right.
Nevertheless, people were asking the military to do more in op-eds and to lean further forward. Talk about what that was like for you as a senior retired military, to see people recommending that the military, make some statements about who was going to be president or not.
Well, a couple of thoughts. First, though, I was shocked, dismayed probably as well. And it's probably more a reflection of the esteem in which the institution of the military is held. In other words, the erosion of trust in our institutions has been going on for some time. And I don't know, I hope it crescendoed, but it may not yet have crescendoed. We're still having challenges, as you've seen now that you're back from England, about our confidence in our elections. So I guess I wasn't surprised that people would say, wow, I wonder if the institution we do trust can help us somehow. Mm-hmm. The answer to that is no. And just to show you how strongly I believe in that, and those of us who served with me believe in it. When we were helping the Iraqis run their elections, the very first one, which as I recall was 2004 or 5, I don't remember exactly. One of the things that came up was who's going to guard the polling sites, the election sites. And Jerry Bremer and others, who was the Coalition Provisional Authority, said, well, clearly the U.S. military needs to secure those polling sites. And we said, then it's never going to be seen as a free and fair election. It just won't. It'll be, who do the Americans want to put into office? And so we really worked hard to put together enough of an Iraqi military and Iraqi police. And we said, okay, you who are the people with the most skin in this game in your own first national election, you've got the interior will be on the perimeter. We'll seal the perimeter, of any potential terrorist attacks or insurgent attacks. But Iraqis are going to be in the middle of this, and you won't see an American soldier in any image of Iraqi elections. That's how strongly we felt about it, and that was in a foreign country,
right?
So,
and so we have the election without much of a military role, and then now bringing us to January 6th,
right,
2021, an extraordinary moment. Can you just talk a little bit about what your thoughts were as you were? I assume you were watching, or at least
for me it was the thing about where were you on 9/11? I can remember vividly. It was that powerful to me. Today's Flag Day, and look, I'm a realist about patriotism. Patriotism waxes and wanes. If we're under some foreign threat, patriotism waxes. If we're pulling each other apart over social justice and other things, patriotism tends to wane. It is what it is. Right. And so I've seen the flag carried around the rink of when the miracle on ice occurred in 1980, when we beat the Soviet Union in ice hockey.
We're showing our age.
I know exactly. I know for sure none of them, maybe not even their parents. But the point is, I've seen that, and there was something special about that. And now I've seen it, the flag carried menacingly at our own Capitol. And this is the two extremes of my emotions about the flag and about patriotism. So it was really disturbing to me. And but just to show you how polarized we are. Not irrecoverably, I don't think. I don't know how you feel that, but we are polarized. I had immediately, even some of my West Point classmates, contact me and say, "Don't be fooled. These are not Trump supporters. This is Antifa." And I thought, "Oh my God! In the middle of an attack on the Capitol, we're going to argue about who these people are. I don't care who they are. They don't belong." Beaten through the windows of the U.S. Capitol, Well, and the lack of preparedness was stunning to me.
Well, you raised the two questions that I wanted to ask. One was a critique was leveled against the DoD for being inadequately prepared and maybe slow to respond to the threat. On the one hand, the other critique was, at least initial reports seemed to raise the specter that there was a disproportionate number of veterans, maybe even a few active duty units. We now know statistically that that's not the case. They weren't overrepresented. Still, there were enough for it to be troubling and raised the question about the reliability of the force. So if you could speak briefly to both of those, and then we'll finally shift to the foreign.
Yeah, so on the issue of the speed of decision making, you and I have taught courses together, and it's interesting. Students will sometimes have this sense that the word bureaucracy is a pejorative term. And look, bureaucracy is put into place so that you may not make the best decision, but you really won't normally make the absolute wrong decision. It's put in place to create some of the friction in decision-making that leads to a reasonable decision. I've never talked to anybody about this, but I'm quite confident that the Lafayette Square decisions were the reason for the delays in the not any nefarious, I could be wrong, but it doesn't feel to me that it was a nefarious attempt to protect the Trump supporters. Rather, on January 6th, rather what it seemed to me to be was that the DOD got hammered for making a quick decision about things related to Lafayette Square, and they were not going to make that decision again. Right. And so the bureaucracy kicked in and the decision was slow. Now, was it, I don't know whether I don't know if there was malfeasance at work. What I do know is it wouldn't surprise me if it really did turn out to be just pure bureaucracy.
And in DOD's defense, there were heavyweights like all the former secretaries of defense who came out with living secretaries of defense, signed an op-ed 2 days earlier saying, don't get involved.
Right. That's right.
And there were lightweights like me writing op-eds making the same point. And others who saying, look, the military does not have a role in this. And so we are pushing them further and further back in the saddle rhetorically. And then suddenly the threat that emerges is something a little different. I think they were primarily worried about a clash between say an Antifa-led throng and a MAGA-led throng, and the two of them meeting somewhere. And that didn't happen, but that was the contingency they were prepared.
I believe that to be true.
So they had reasons for being slow, and it's unfortunate. What about the second problem, though, are you worried about the reliability of the force, of too many people in the force who might be sympathetic to a narrative that says the 2020 election was stolen and therefore it's illegitimate?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I hope everyone listening realizes that because we're a volunteer force, we have two goals. One is to make sure the force is representative of America. We don't want to just recruit in certain parts of the country. We want, or with certain demographics, we genuinely want the force to represent the country that it represents. And so you're going to get into the force. You've watched Blue Bloods, with that's not an advertisement for Tom Selleck, but rather, that scene at the end of the show where they're arguing over Sunday dinner. That happens all across the country, maybe not quite as artfully as it is on the show. And, the young men and women grow up hearing these arguments and reading, and they're on social media, and then we recruit them. And they come into the military with a certain set of beliefs, some of which are actually, close matches to what we really want them to do, and some of which are not close matches. And it's our job to work through that, recognizing that if you really want to represent the country, you're going to get diversity. You're also going to get diversity of views. And so we've got to work with that. Am I worried? Yeah, I'm not worried long-term. I'm worried in the short term, we might overreact to things and put together a bunch of PowerPoint slides and, team teaching and actually create a problem that, or make a problem worse. But long-term, I think I'm not worried.
Okay, well, we spent a lot more time on domestic
Do you
stuff.
agree with that, Ben?
Well, I do. And I think this is exactly the kind of problem that a politicized Washington will overreact to, which will then create a similar overreaction. You get the pendulum swing. That said, I think there are real questions about the health of the force, the strains, particularly on certain units that have been heavily utilized. And then we're asking the military to do a whole lot of stuff and to transition from what had been training and preparing to do for the last 20 years into a different range. So I do think there are unique strains or distinctive strains on the professionalism of the force. And so I'm glad that Secretary Austin and General Milley have identified that as a priority.
Yeah.
Now, that's a good segue to foreign threats, which is the
Those
more
are the easy
familiar
ones.
thing. Those are the ones you spend most of your life
Yeah, right.
thinking about. Let's begin where the president is today.
Okay.
President Biden is at a NATO summit.
Mhm.
The role of the chairman is to identify threats and risks. So when you look at the NATO theater, what are the threats and risks that you think Biden needs to be concerned about?
Well, because that conversation happens in the sit room and in the Oval Office of the president constantly. We know whenever the chairman's there, that's the conversation is. And the way I found it most helpful for me to communicate with President Obama was, instead of talking about risk as it's something abstract, because it can get really abstract, I used to talk to him about probability and consequences.
Okay.
So now let's talk about the European theater in terms of probability and consequences. The probability of so it's NATO and it's the Russian Federation, and its pretty clear intent to reestablish a sphere of influence. Whether they'll ever try to reestablish a Soviet Union, I doubt, but I do think it's pretty clear that Vladimir Putin felt that NATO and the U.S. in particular took advantage of Russia when the wall fell and NATO expanded, moved the border, between NATO and Russia 1,000 kilometers to the east. And so I think he's looking for ways to reassert something like a sphere of influence, which also has some economic benefits for a country that's really struggling right now. So probability of a conflict with Russia is actually quite low. Problem is the consequences are unimaginable. And so when you're talking to the president about the European theater, you've got low probability and unimaginable consequence. And so you really have to be serious about it. And the way the United States, since after World War II, have chosen to deal with Europe is through the NATO alliance. And so I think, I don't know if I'm a globalist. Globalism also took on a bit of a pejorative connotation. I do believe, though, in our alliance system as making us far more secure than we could ever possibly be by ourselves. And so I think that the emphasis, or let's call it rekindling is probably the right word, of our relationship with NATO on any number of issues, but Russia in particular is spot on.
So today, the president said that our Article 5 obligation, which is the commitment to treat an attack on any of our NATO allies as an attack on the United States, he called that a sacred obligation. Of course, that's an obligation backed up literally by the lives of our men and women in uniform. Do you think that the men and women in uniform view that Article 5 promise across the board of our NATO allies? I mean, it's not just the UK or France. There's some smaller countries closer to Russia. Do you think Americans really are willing to risk their lives, or the American men and women in uniform to risk their lives on behalf of those eastmost?
No, that's a great question. I can tell you that, I grew up spending most of the early part of my career in Europe, facing off against what was then the Soviet Union. And we believed it. And I suspect that the American soldier does believe that. We tend to still be, our linkages to Europe still tend to be stronger than our linkages anywhere else in the world. Most of our ethnicities still derive from Europe. So I think so. But that's not to say that there aren't issues where that gets a lot more complicated. For example, cyber. When does an act rise to the level of being a hostile act, not just a malicious or a distributed denial of services? When does it become an attack? Because that's what the language in the document says. An attack on one is an attack on all. I don't know if that includes cyber. Probably not, at least based on recent experience. So there are issues like that, where a cyber attack could elicit, kind of an asymmetric or a conventional response that might complicate things. Or, what Russia did in Crimea, where they don't actually go in and destroy anything in particular, but rather seize it and hold it hostage, I suppose. There's some cities especially in the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, where ethnic populations of, Russian ethnicity matters a lot, and maybe more than Estonian ethnicity or nationalism. And so, I think the seizure of one of those towns could really complicate things. But those are the kind of things that, that have to be worked out in advance so that you're not, you don't suffer a failure of imagination when something happens.
Do you think that Putin took the lesson from Crimea, that he could get away with it? Because basically that happened. And while there was economic sanctions, there was no military consequence.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. That's an important distinction, so we're not, I was in the sit room when that happened, and there were people arguing that, this could be the demise of NATO. And, my advice was, well, Ukraine is not NATO. They aspire to be, but they're not. And so I do. And by the way, the same thing happened in Georgia, in the two provinces in Georgia. So I think what Putin has, I think he has a playbook. And I think it's an effective playbook. I know people get mad when I say, wow, are you admiring Putin? No, I'm not admiring Putin, but I'm telling you that the playbook is working for him. But it's yet to be rolled out for a NATO country. And I think that's the red line, to be honest.
I put it that he's playing a weak hand deftly. Absolutely. For the short run, but incurring long-term consequences that will hurt it.
I hope so.
Hurt in the long run. Yeah. Let's shift to an area where tragically too many Americans had to risk and lost their lives in the last 20 years, and that is the Centcom Theater. And there's not enough time to deal with the historical wars, so I'm just going to ask two questions from in this theater. Iran, what's the prospects of war with Iran? And then I'll have a question about Afghanistan.
Yeah, so there the probability seems to me to be kind of right about in the middle, and I'll tell you why. And the consequences would be significant in the near term, but I suspect over time they would diminish fairly rapidly. That is, provided they don't have nuclear weapons. Now, one of the things about Iran that I think bears watching, and I'm sure that people are watching, is they're getting ready for a succession plan. The Ayatollah Khomeini is 82. They're about to elect a new president, Raisi, I think, Raisi. He's running he's running in a contest that's where no one else is competing, so he will be elected president. He's very hardline, and many think that he could be the successor to Khomeini. But in any case, the trend lines in Iran are away from moderation and toward extremism, or being a regional a country with the aspiration to be a hegemon in its own region and to export its brand of politics and religion. Makes it dangerous.
The Iranian Navy sent some ships into the Atlantic. Should we worry about that? Should Americans worry about that?
No. I mean, I hate to admit it, but the Navy is probably the one service. Well, that's true. I mean, honestly, the Air Force, American soldiers, today's the Army birthday, haven't been attacked from the air since, not counting 9/11, but haven't been attacked since 1953. So we still enjoy a pretty significant dominance of the air and the maritime domains. They can do some damage, the Iranians, and there would be lives lost, but not strategically significant.
Well, let me ask you about Afghanistan. As I look at what President Biden is contemplating doing, which is withdrawing, well, not contemplating, he's ordered and it's happening. It really reminds me of the departure from Iraq in 2011, 2012, which didn't go well. ISIS came in its wake. There are real risks happening. If you were chairman of the Joint, would you advise, as General Milley apparently advised, sir, don't do this?
Yes, but let me caveat it. The active Army it's 485,000. And, I could go down the services and talk about, fighter squadrons and submarines and aircraft carriers. And, back to my paradigm of probability and consequence, the probability of terrorism continuing to be a problem for the world, not just for the United States, is about as high as it could be. So probability is high. Consequence, compared to the other things we've been talking about, much lower. So the question for me would be, if we're going to take this military of ours and we're going to do what almost everyone agrees we must, which is do everything we possibly can to avoid a war with China and Russia because of the presence of nuclear weapons and the implications of getting into an escalation with them, the bill payer is going to be the Middle East. So it does seem to me the prudent thing to do. It would be to lower both our profile, but also our mission set there. But there are good reasons to still be in South Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan's right next door, India right next door to that, Iran, I mean, it goes Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, very volatile combination. So what I would have hoped would have happened, what I would have recommended was to try to find that level where we still have influence, we still can build relationships, we can protect ourselves. And I don't know what that number would be. I knew what that number was when I was chairman, and we were walking toward it, not running toward it. So I do think there's still a role for us in that part of the world. The question is, how do we exercise that role?
Well, in a moment, I'm going to get to questions from the audience, which have been sent in over Zoom. And one of them touches directly on what you just said, but I would be committing moderator malpractice if we didn't talk about China.
Yes, you would.
And Taiwan. So
Yeah.
let's shift further east to Indo-PACOM Theater. And let me focus just on the China piece of it. That's probably the biggest change since when you were chairman, is the change in U.S. orientation towards China.
Yes.
In military and national security terms. So we've gone from looking at like we could cooperate with them to fearing, some people are fearing that they will overtake the United States in military power and geopolitical influence. Where are you in that spectrum of concern about the China threat?
I'm concerned that about the trend lines. Let me start by saying, I think the way that this administration has chosen to describe the challenges of China and Russia is actually quite artful. Instead of it being, a hysteria about China in particular, they characterize their national security strategy as pitting those nations in the world who believe in democracy against those nations in the world who are autocracies and dictatorships. That's actually right. Now, what you do with that, I think the description is artful. What you do with it is something else. Second, I really think we have to understand China's motivations. And, we could roll out Thucydides again if we want. Fear, all nations are motivated by the same three things: fear, honor, and interests. So China's interest is in sustaining its economy. I mean, I think we have to, again, not being apologetic for things like the atrocities against the Uyghurs and things like that, but China's Road and Belt Initiative, its outreach is actually about, it seems to me, about finding a secure supply chain to sustain 1.4 billion people and climbing. And so what we have to watch is that our alliance system doesn't collide with their supply chain. That's really, about as simple as I could put it. There, like in Europe, I think the answer is an alliance system. An alliance system, and by the way, we don't really have them. I mean, we have allies in the Pacific and Indo-Pacific. We don't have an alliance system. And so I think that, and we tried, by the way, we tried to empower ASEAN. We tried the Trans-Pacific Partnership was actually more about trying to build an alliance system than it was about, some dramatic economic change in the world. But I do think what we've got to do with China is understand what is motivating it. They're in the South China Sea because they need resources. And what we have to do again, with some kind of alliance system is make sure that international norms are not violated in a way that could really affect us in the long run. By the way, China will tell you, and I had so many conversations with my Chinese counterpart. We actually met twice a year. At every meeting, he told me two things. One of them was that nothing to fear with China, because what China is really trying to do is, secure its own sovereignty. It has no aspirations to expand beyond its 9-dash line. And the second thing was, he would say, we have one issue that we will not tolerate with any interference, and it's Taiwan.
Well, I was going to go there because the most difficult country in the way you sketched out the problem is Taiwan. Is Taiwan an ally of the United States? Not a formal treaty ally, but it's a partner. And the Taiwan Relations Act pledges us to commit to a non-violent resolution of the issue. And that, it strikes me as one of the most dangerous flashpoints in the world today. Would you agree that the Taiwan flashpoint is even more dangerous today than it was when you were hearing this from?
Well, I do, because the rhetoric's not the right word. The discourse or the accusations that get thrown back and forth between us and the Chinese heighten the emotion. And then secondly, we have begun to give them weapon systems that are less clearly defensive in nature, which of course the Chinese interpret as in some way, putting them at mainland China interprets as putting them at greater risk. So the risk is higher. I wish I could tell you that I know enough about that issue to be able to provide good advice on it. I do not. But if you ask me a simple question, I'll give you a simple answer. Is it a bigger flashpoint now than it was just a few years ago? The answer is yes.
It seems to me that the policy community, at least the political part of the policy community is mostly aligned towards, we've got to get tough with China. But there is a influential view that says Taiwan's too hard and we need to be clear that we're not going to fight over Taiwan. Too hard to defend. Mm-hmm. And you'll see, particularly in the academic world, security studies world, you'll see lots of people writing basically that it's time to admit that we're not going to go to war over Taiwan and cut our losses before it triggers a war where we can't control the escalation. Do you have a view on?
Well, yeah, I do. My view is that, we have to, I think we are at our strongest when we are, in fact, that nation that promotes its values, one of which is that people have a right to choose the way they're governed and the way they live. And that's, Taiwan is a democracy. So I think it would send a chill through a lot of places in other parts of the world were we to say, you know what, we're not going to fight over over Taiwan.
So I'd love to keep going, but I would love even more to involve the audience. So here's a question we got from a general audience question. During the Trump administration, there was a push for a quote, America First policy, get us out of Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and put America first. Can you share your thoughts on the role and speed that the military has in executing orders like this from the commander in chief? Or put another way, do you think that the military slow rolled and shirked when President Trump was indicating he wanted out of Syria, out of Afghanistan?
First of all, the military there's always a bit of shirking in issues that are decided in a way that the military might think puts the nation at greater risk. It's just human nature. It's not that, and by the way, I hope I wasn't guilty of that, but it's one of those things where you're not bringing a bunch of people in a room and say, okay, what's the slowest we can do this and not get ourselves fired? That's not what happens. It's kind of a cacophony of follow-on questions. Right. Okay, you want us out of Syria? What about this? 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 And given that the bureaucracy is going to take time to answer those questions, it takes a while to go. Now, some of that is just good planning, but you and I both know some of it is shirking at times. The one thing that made that, here's an observation. I probably came out of when I came out of the Obama administration, I think the Obama administration had the most finely tuned process of decision-making. I'm not saying that in a complimentary way. President Obama got a decision-making process put in place in the National Security Council and its architecture that was exactly what he wanted. It was deliberate, it was inclusive, it was slow. I think that was part of his belief in issues like Iraq and Afghanistan, that precipitous issues generally don't go well, whether I agreed with them or not. I came out of an administration where the process was visible and always it was always working, churning. President Trump came and said, you know what? I don't really like process. So some of what can be interpreted as slowing things down is also, if you haven't had the chance to, take this prism and look at it through the different angles of the prism, or turn the Rubik's Cube until you can get a couple of sides lined up. If you haven't had the chance to do that, you're not really sure what the president really wants. Right. And so I think that some of what can be interpreted as the military, saying, you know what, we don't like the idea, so we're not going to do it, is, oh my God, he wants us out of Syria. But how do I get back to him and say, well, what about Idlib? What are we going to do about Idlib? What are we going to do about the border crossings in Turkey where the humanitarian, there wasn't that kind of gut-wrenching detail that normally goes into a decision.
And also on Afghanistan, the president said, I want out of Afghanistan. Right. And they said, are you sure? What about this? What about this? What about that? And then when push came to shove, the president said, maybe not.
Right.
And when Biden they said, are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure? Biden said, yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. At least so far.
At least so far.
And so if President Trump had said, no, I'm doing it,
we'd be out.
We'd be out. Mm-hmm. And of course, the gray zone question there is, what about the last couple of weeks in January when the system, last couple of weeks of his term? We don't have time to go into that, but that would be an interesting gray zone question of maybe something different.
So just before we leave that one, I want to make sure I was clear. Every president gets to decide how they will make decisions. That's their right to figure that out. One administration might have a very intricate process and another one might not. And the military doesn't get to vote on which process we live with.
So here's a question from AGS Council member Peter Connolly. President Biden spoke heavily at the G7 summit about the importance of showing democracy's strength. But how can the U.S. project strength and the benefits of democracy to encourage democracy abroad without appearing hypocritical? Is our own house in order to the point where we can promote democracy abroad?
I think the best conversations that I had with counterparts were conversations where we all applauded our commitment to democracy. And by the way, every one of my counterparts had a slightly different form of democracy. We all applauded and celebrated the fact that we represented democracies. And then we all expressed some doubt about it. You know what I mean? It's almost like religion, Peter. I don't want to suggest that democracy is a religion, but I will suggest to you that there's an analogy there. With religion, you're encouraged, organized religion anyway, you're encouraged to worship first and then go ahead and doubt, but worship first. And I think about patriotism that way, by the way. I think, you should, in my judgment, you should embrace the rituals of patriotism, standing for the national anthem, and doubt, because there's reason to doubt. And so I think, to answer the question as, as probably as abstractly as I can possibly answer it, I think that I don't think the rest of the world sees us as hypocritical. I think some of them are probably saying, it's about time they had some of the problems we've been having for a long time. And, I think they're strong enough to work through it. And that better be what we do, by the way.
Let me ask a question. We've got a couple of questions that came in totally different domain. Women required to register for the draft.
Right.
That's a case that
Yeah.
was pitched to the Supreme Court. They've punted on it. But where would you come down as you were also Chief of Staff of the Army, so
Yep.
you were responsible for building the Army.
Yep.
Do you think women should be included in the draft?
Absolutely. I mean, look, I was with Secretary Panetta, as you recall, we rescinded the combat exclusion for women. We opened up every branch to women, provided they can meet the standard. And a big reason we did that, I mean, obviously we wanted to give women an opportunity to serve their country just the same as men have the opportunity. Again, provided the standards could be met. But we didn't do it out of the goodness of our heart. It wasn't, I'm going to be the chairman who is going to be seen as being the most, the wisest of the wise. We need them. When you look at our ability to attract, recruit, and retain an all volunteer force, it's getting harder and harder and harder. And it's getting harder because of any number of reasons. Health, a big one, fitness, education. It's just harder to recruit. And so one of the things we said was, if 10 years from now, we're going to run into a case where we can't recruit enough men, there's another population out there we actually can reach into. And why wait 10 years to do that? Because it's going to take about 10 years to put this in place. That's why we rescinded all of those restrictions on women. And I firmly believe that we're a better Army in those units that actually embrace that.
Okay, last question, perfect for the Army birthday question. And this comes from the commander of Duke's Naval ROTC unit. He wrote, "In what domain do you see our next conflict? Or put another way, where should the bulk of the DoD budget be focused?" I'm going to put a sharper focus.
Yeah.
Are we spending too much money on ground troops and not enough on Navy and air assets, given the likelihood of future conflict?
Yeah, boy, that's such a tough question. There's a lot of countries in the world that can do that. In other words, that can make that kind of choice. I think China has, for example. Although they have a 1 million man standing army, I don't see them conceiving of using them in an expeditionary fashion. I absolutely see them using their Navy in an expeditionary fashion. And I think that a conflict in the Indo-Pac region would likely be a naval and aviation centric in terms of domains. But I think the answer is, to the first part of his question, in what domain will the next conflict be fought? The answer is yes, all domains, space, cyber. I don't think we've named cyber a domain, maybe we have, but space and cyber and above the sea and beneath the sea and aviation. And yes, there will be land conflict, despite everyone's reluctance to make it a land conflict. It just, that's, when you establish supply lines and you have to protect them, when you establish airfields and have to protect them, when you create humanitarian crises and you have to relieve them, it ends up being an all domain affair. Now, in terms of the balance in this budget, I don't think that, you're right that the administration punted. So did my administrations, the ones where I was part. We always punted it. 4 years in a row we punted. And we punted because the advocacy in the Congress is quite strong for a balanced, in the sense of this is your historical share of the budget. And next year you might get $1.50 less than that. The year after you might get $1.50 more. But the advocacy on the Hill is quite remarkable for keeping that kind of balance. And I'm sure that the professor of military science knows this, and some of these students coming in will learn it. But it's the Congress that gets to decide what kind of armed forces we have, not the military itself, not the commander in chief. By Article 1, the Congress can raise and sustain the force. And so if we have a quarrel with how they're doing that, we ought to ask them.
Well, I think we've demonstrated what American grand strategy is all about. It's about wrestling with really thorny issues that have direct relevance to now and the future, but all of them have long tails into the past that we have to understand. That it's a rewarding experience to talk with someone like yourself who's served in positions of great responsibility and who can shed light and help us understand the choices that we're facing today. And it's more fun to do that in person. And so I just say to the rest of you all that I can't wait to see you all in person and come be involved in all that we're doing this academic year in person. But before that, do sign up for the remaining summer Zooms that are available to you all. And that they're little amuse-bouches and little appetizers for what's coming in the fall. But thank you for joining us and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Peter. Have a good summer. We'll see you in the fall.